For more, we're joined by Raja Mohan. He's visiting research professor with the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. Professor, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us. I want to start by asking you about Vietnam, a good example of an ASEAN country that Chinese companies use to circumvent US tariffs. So with that potentially cut off, what can Xi Jinping offer? I mean, we know that China has excess capacity, meaning it probably cannot absorb, much from these offshoring countries.
No, I think you asked the right question. I mean, what Xi is saying is fascinating. He says, look, China and Southeast Asian partners should safeguard the global economic order, preserve the gains of economic globalization, strengthen supply chains, and deeper integration of the two regions. But here is the crux of the problem. I mean, I think China is ASEAN's largest trading partner, but China and ASEAN is a skewed trade that China has a $200 billion trade surplus with the whole of ASEAN, and ASEAN has a $200 billion trade surplus with the United States. So here you are, while China is a major partner, China doesn't accept too many imports from Southeast Asia. While the US does not export much, it actually takes most of ASEAN's imports. So I think this, as the US and China get at each other's throats, how does Vietnam and ASEAN as a whole manage these tensions? I think that is the big question, because they can lose neither of the partners. But I think the two partners, that is US and China, are at loggerheads. So I think the key question to watch is, one thing, can Xi open up his market for more exports from the ASEAN region? There, I think there are no clear answers. In fact, we've seen last few years, most Southeast Asian countries raising anti-dumping duties against the Chinese goods. Lots of small industries are being wiped out in the industrialized parts of ASEAN. So I think it's quite a moment for Southeast Asia as a whole.
Yeah, Professor, so Xi is calling for multilateralism, stable supply chains, but I wonder, coming from China, how is that message likely to be received in the region, still wary of Beijing's economic and territorial ambitions? Can China truly be seen as a fair and stable alternative to the US?
Whether they see it or not, they're not going to say it. Given the strength of the partnership that exists and the fact that China is so large and it looms over Southeast Asia. So I think the Southeast Asians know, look, the trade deficit with China is going to be a bigger and bigger problem, because we're not just talking in abstraction, but the China's powerful transformation and expansion of its manufacturing sector. Now China controls almost 35% of the global manufacturing. Some people say by the end of this decade, it could go up to 40%. So how does ASEAN retain its industrial base in the context of what people call the second export shock from China? And I think this will raise all kinds of questions. One is the diplomatic, how do you navigate between US and China? But more consequential question for Southeast Asian nations is, what do they do internally? How do they rework their economies so that they don't get at the receiving end of both China and the US?
Okay, more on that in terms of what the bloc can do in a moment. But I want to just focus on the diplomatic aspect of this. Vietnam, again, an example of a country that has managed to balance its ties with both China and the United States very well. It's hosted both leaders, and it's also elevated bilateral ties, to the highest level. So will Hanoi and like-minded regional leaders be able to continue to do this? Because we know that Trump has been watching. He's already saying that China and Vietnam were trying to figure out, and this is a direct quote, figure out how do we screw the United States of America?
No, I think you talked about Vietnam's great flexible diplomacy. It was called the bamboo diplomacy. In fact, last year, Vietnam was the only country that hosted the world's top three leaders, that is President Biden, President Xi, and President Putin. But I think that was under the Biden years. So Biden was far more, shall we say, indulgent. But today, I think with Trump deciding to confront China on the trade policies, that question of the balancing is going to be much harder for Vietnam, because Vietnam is actually the largest trading partner for China in Asia, in ASEAN. And then we've seen a dramatic surge of Chinese exports to Vietnam and Vietnamese exports to the US. Now, Trump and this team now wants to block that door that Chinese goods do not come into the US through Vietnam. And the pressure from the US has already seen. There was a phone call between Secretary General To Lam and President Trump a few days ago. Vietnamese negotiators are in Washington. And I think Trump's anger, we've already seen his comments about screwing the US. But my sense is that this is really a test for Vietnam, that how does it manage? Historically, it's done this very well. But now I think the scale of interdependence for Vietnam with both US and China and the conflict between US and China is going to test bamboo diplomacy to its limits.
And Professor, we know that President Xi is headed for Malaysia. Of course, Malaysia is ASEAN chair. It's been calling for a united regional front against Trump's tariffs. But I wonder, is a joint response even realistic? And if ASEAN stays divided, does that hand more leverage to powers like US and China? And are we already seeing that happen?
In fact, Malaysia is actually one of the few countries that has a trade surplus with China. So they're in a slightly different place, but I don't know how long that will last. So I think in this kind of situations, maintaining unity is pretty hard. I mean, that we've seen this in the case of South China Sea, where it's been hard for Southeast Asia, ASEAN as a whole, to develop a strong common position. And now when the stakes are much higher in terms of what the trade war means for jobs and prosperity in all these countries, I would suspect there'll be quite a tension between collective bargaining and at the same time protecting your own individual interests. And when that tension comes to that head, I mean, my sense is most countries will look after themselves rather than in an abstract notion of working together to deal with US and China.
Okay, Professor Mohan, we'll have to leave it there for now, but thank you very much for your insight this morning. See Raja Mohan, visiting research professor with the Institute of South Asian Studies at NUS.